Hi everybody, Miss Gray's class. My name is Davoud. I'm a friend of Miss Gray's from growing up. We went to school together from kindergarten all the way through the end of high school, and we're close friends growing up, still close friends now. And she told me that you're all learning about the Iranian Revolution and that you're reading Persepolis. And I was very excited to hear that because I am Iranian. My dad's family is from Iran. And I didn't get a chance, unfortunately, in school growing up to learn about the Iranian Revolution. What I knew about it was from my family. And I don't think a lot of kids learn about that in school. So I'm very excited you're all learning about that. Miss Gray asked if I could talk about my family story with the Iranian Revolution because my family fled as a result of the revolution, and my family is also Jewish. So there was kind of a particular story and a particular series of events that occurred to my family that was living there as a result of the revolution, but also as a result of their religion. So I wanted to tell you all a little bit about that and a little bit about the history of my family and other Iranian Jewish families in the country prior to the revolution. So Jews have been in Iran for thousands of years, actually, and throughout, all the millennia up until the revolution, there were a bunch of different conditions for Jews living in the country. In certain cases, they were, relatively respected religious minority, and in other cases, they were pretty discriminated against. And in the years leading up to the Shah coming into power, a new Shah or king in Iran came into power in 1926 named Reza Shah. And in the dynasty before, the Qajar dynasty, they faced a lot of discrimination. And my great-grandfather, who I'm named after, also named Davoud, and his brothers grew up in Iran, in Tehran, the capital, in the early 20th century. They were born around 1912 and the surrounding years. And in those times when they were kids, they lived in a neighborhood called the Mahalleh, which was the Jewish quarter of the city, and it was a ghetto in that all the Jews lived there, and they were pretty segregated from the rest of society. And there were a lot of laws that discriminated against Jews as a religious group there. And an example, for example, of a law that was pretty harsh and cruel towards Jews as a minority group was that when it rained outside, Jews weren't allowed to be outside of their homes because the thought was that if the rain touched the Jews' skin and then washed into the street, it would make the street impure and make other people who basically touched that water, it would make them dirty because Jews were considered, a dirty, lesser people. So that was obviously, a very unfortunate situation, and it was a little bit difficult for Jews in the country at that time. But when Reza Shah came into power, he had a big goal of westernizing the country, so to speak, and taking Iran away from a more traditional society that had those sorts of stereotypes into one that was a little bit more driven by things like success in business and things like that. I don't think he was really a great idealist that wanted all religious groups necessarily to thrive in the country, but he was a little bit more pragmatic. And in 1944, he was pushed out of power, essentially, for his son, named Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. And he was a lot more liberal-minded and was very accepting of all the different religious groups living in the country, because in Iran there are many, many dozens of religious groups, the major ones being Muslims, Christians, Baha'i, which is a religion that started in Iran in the 19th century, and Jews. And then, there are a bunch of other ones such as Zoroastrians and, smaller religious groups. And in those years, kind of from 1944 up until the late 70s when the revolution happened, it was kind of the golden age, so to speak, of Jewish experience in the country. Jews reached high-level positions, as did members of all religious groups. And in terms of religious discrimination, Iran was a far better place for people of all different faiths and religious backgrounds. But in the years leading up to the revolution, as you learned about in Persepolis and you're learning in Miss Gray's class, many people were dissatisfied with the Shah. And, this led to huge widespread protests across a bunch of different groups, religious groups, socioeconomic classes, different parts of the country. There were kind of protests among all of them because the Shah had some very bad policies, that had a secret police force, didn't allow for freedom of speech, political expression, these sorts of things. And my family specifically got very caught up in the sort of tide of the revolution, because the revolution started as an ideal to get the Shah out of power and replace it with a government that was representative of what Iranian people wanted. But it so turned out that the people who were able to grasp power when the revolution really took place were not representative of the people of Iran, and were more extreme in the way that they thought, I suppose. And they really wanted in Iran along the lines of their ideology, and in Iran that basically gave them more power and more wealth at the expense of all the rest of the people. And my family saw this happening and saw a lot of violence in the lead up to the revolution. So everyone in my family left, including my great-grandfather Davoud. He was on the last flight out of Iran before Khomeini, the Ayatollah who came into power with the revolution, arrived in Tehran. But one member of my family, whose name was Habib, the brother of my great-grandfather, stayed in Iran. He stayed for a number of reasons. He said he didn't want to leave his country. He really loved his country. It's where he'd been his entire life. He felt like he had done nothing wrong. All of his business was there. He had been in the prior Ministry of Commerce with the prior government. And yeah, he really loved being there. And in addition, he was the head of the Jewish Association of the country. So he felt, as the head of the religious community of Jews, which was somewhere around 80 to 100,000 people at the time, he should stay and really show that they didn't have something to be afraid of, and that they could still have a future in the tomorrow's Iran. Unfortunately, a few months after Khomeini arrived, Habib was arrested and arbitrarily, for no real reason, charged with a bunch of so-called crimes. He was charged with being a spy against Iran for Israel, which was, completely not true. He was charged with something called friendships with the enemies of God. And these charges were really motivated in part by his religious faith. He was a member of the prior government in a certain respect. He wasn't really an elected official, but he was appointed to help the government basically set policies that would lead to greater economic success. So he had worked with the old government, so the new government didn't like him for that reason. But he was kind of seen as someone who could be made an example of, and could be, eventually executed, which is what happened to him, unfortunately. Because of his religious faith, they felt that they could say, he is not really one of us, and thus he's expendable. So sadly, he was executed in May of 1979, a few months after the revolution happened, and that was the last remaining family member of mine in the country. And the rest of my family was scattered around the world, in London and in New York mostly, but they also went to Los Angeles, where there's a really big Persian population. A lot of Persian Jews specifically went there. And some of my family went to France, to Paris as well. And yeah, so that's the story of my family. I think there's still a lot of love for Iran and the country itself speaking for myself and the rest of my family. But it's, a very unfortunate and sad situation what happened when, Jews were basically made not a part of the country's future in certain respects because they were different from the majority. And I forgot to mention, after Habib, my great-grandfather's brother, was executed, about 3/4 of the Jews remaining in Iran left. So it went from 80 or 100,000 to around 20,000, and today there's only about 10,000 Jews left in the country. So yeah, that's the story of my family, a little bit of background about Jews in Iran, and yeah, I hope that was interesting for you all. Once again, I'm very happy you're all learning about it, and I'm very happy that you all have Miss Gray as a teacher. She's a great teacher, I'm sure, and she's a great friend. So yeah, thanks for listening. Have a good one, everybody.